The EFF marks the 31st anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide, in which close to 1 million people were massacred in 1994. The massacre targeted the Tutsi ethnic group as well as moderate Hutus over a period of 100 days. The genocide remains a stark reminder of black-on-black violence, an act we need to bury and rise above as Africans. Greetings, Africa Zonga, Africa and the world, and thanks very much for tuning in to this week's edition of the EFF podcast. My name is Titus Tsungur, and today we are reflecting on the 31st anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, in which almost 1 million people were killed in Rwanda in 1994. And for that discussion, we are joined by Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, a political analyst from the Nelson Mandela University. Prof, thank you very much for coming through onto the EFF podcast, and welcome.
Thank you very much, my brother, for having me, and a good morning to all your viewers.
Jumbo Africa, indeed. And Prof, perhaps let's begin here. Let's perhaps understand the concept of pan-Africanism before we dive deep into today's topic. What do you understand of the concept pan-Africanism? What does it mean to you?
The idea of pan-Africanism was initiated by our former leaders, the likes of Kagame in Ghana, working together with the likes of KK, that is Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, and then others joined Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and then, of course, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and many others. The idea behind the pan-Africanism was to try and bring together Africans so that they could speak in one voice. I'm just referring to these leaders because these were the latest ones to propagate the idea of pan-Africanism. But in actual fact, it started some years back when our African leaders were saying that there is no way that the African continent can address its challenges if countries work as separate entities. So therefore, the idea was that they must come together, amplify their voice, so that when they deal with their erstwhile colonizers, then they will be doing so from a stronger position. That's in essence what Pan-Africanism was all about. So bringing all Africans together, regardless of where you are in terms of the geographical boundaries that were drawn by the colonial administrators.
And in your view, Prof, does Pan-Africanism find expression in the current political landscape in the continent?
I don't think so, my brother. I'll be honest with you. I don't think so, because we still have vestiges of colonialism. In the first instance, you will know that the African continent has been compartmentalized. There are those who are described as Francophone states, those that were colonized by France. You have Anglophone states, those that were colonized by Britain, and then you have Lusophone states, those that were colonized by Portugal. And this plays itself out even when our heads of states have meetings in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to discuss the fate of this continent. They would agree on paper as to what needs to be done to take the continent forward, but then immediately after that meeting, they will be having calls with their erstwhile colonizers who will be dictating terms, and then you find that whatever they agreed upon does not come to fruition. So in that context, then I would say that as Africans, we are not as united as one would have wanted us to be, simply because our former colonizers still have a hold on the African continent, which is something regrettable, because we have all the ability to do that, but unfortunately we're not doing it.
Yeah. And the wave of the US tariff has hit Africa by storm. What lessons are we learning from the US as African countries. South Africa is among the hardest hit. If memory serves well, around 30% of the tariff on the US imports has been imposed on Africa, despite the pause announced by the US President Donald Trump that some of the tariffs will be paused for the next 90 days. But what are some of the lessons that are we learning as Africans, in the context of course, South Africa and Africa has got its own mineral resources?
Potatoes, let us be honest about this. Trump is just Trump, and you can't change him. He's just Trump. But then I think he's a blessing in disguise, in the sense that he's giving us a wake-up call that all along we've been depending on other countries to try and address our issues. Even the AU, of course, cannot operate until it gets funding from outside. Our regional bodies, we are talking about SADC, East African Community, ECOWAS, COMESA, you think about all the regional bodies. For them to be effective, they rely on foreign aid. And that is a problem. Because if you look at the African continent, we are very rich in a number of minerals. Look at a country like DRC, for instance. The chaos that is in DRC, in my view, is orchestrated by Westerners who are benefiting from the minerals that are found in the DRC. Even the gadgets we're using right now, they are made of minerals that come from the DRC. And then in the case of South Africa, we have a variety of minerals, but unfortunately, we don't have control over those minerals. You will find that even gold is controlled in the UK, which is basically an embarrassment to the continent. So I think then where Trump comes in with these tariffs that he has imposed on a number of countries is that he's giving us a wake-up call that let us try to find other ways to survive on our own without relying either on America or any other foreign aid for that matter, which is something that we should have done all along. I like leaders like Ibrahim Traore, for example, in Burkina Faso, who has taken a stance saying that the minerals from Burkina Faso should assist people in Burkina Faso and people from within the African continent. So then if we talk about this inter-African trade, then that is where our focus should be, because we have all the minerals, we can survive without the West, in fact. So I think as much as this decision by Trump is terrible, but I think it's a wake-up call that we should then do self-introspection and start doing things differently. The hold for 90 days is nothing else because it's giving us just time to think and then reflect and then map the way forward.
Yeah, and you've spoken about the likes of ECOWAS, the Western regional bloc, the decision that they've taken thereof to have their own currency. Do you think that is the good decision, taking the step forward in as far as reclaiming Africa is concerned?
In fact, what ECOWAS is saying is in line with what the AU has been talking about all along. The idea of having a continental currency is something that has been on the table for quite some time. And the thinking was that you will start off by having regional currencies so that by the time you come together as a continent, then it becomes easier. Because at the moment, we are talking about individual currencies, some of which are very weak. But then the moment you have a regional currency, then it means that we are going to bring together the different regions and then agree on the continental currency. Take a region like the East African Community, for example. If they have a shilling as a regional currency, then we are now sorted. Then we go to West Africa, they come up with their currency. You come to SADC, they come with their currency. Then you bring together these regions and then say, let us now decide on a continental currency, which will then assist us going forward. I think it's a move in the right direction, but for it to be effective, you also need a buy-in from the other regions, because if it's only one region that is doing it, then it's not going to be effective.
And now, South Africa, we understand the GNU is in tension over VAT. Do you think the US tariffs will have any impact on South African politics in as far as our economy is concerned?
That's a very good question. For starters, I don't believe we have a GNU in South Africa. I've made this point several times and I'll make it until I die. We don't have a GNU in South Africa. We have a multi-party coalition which is made up of 10 political parties which were assembled by the ANC, which also did not win the election, but got 40.18%. That is for starters. Number two, this coalition government is in fact a marriage of convenience, a forced marriage, if you will, because none of these parties, I would say, are comfortable in this particular arrangement, except that some are happy to get ministerial positions they would not have gotten if they didn't have this current formation. So basically, the tariffs are coming in at the time when the coalition government itself is not united. The ANC is moving south, the DA is moving west, and yet they say they are part of the same coalition. Whenever things don't go well in South Africa, then parties like the DAC, Donald Trump as their grandfather, they rush to Donald Trump and then they expect him to come in and then meddle in South Africa's internal affairs, which is something that is regrettable. So given that context, therefore, the tariffs that have been imposed on the country are meant to attack those who are anti-US in the eyes of Donald Trump. But in fact, everybody else then is affected. Yourself and myself get affected by this simply because we are South Africans first and foremost before we are members of political parties.
Yeah.
So which means then these tariffs could have been avoided if we had done things right before the May 2024 general election, because we wouldn't be where we are if our politicians were sober-minded and did the right thing. And then maybe lastly, one thing that the ANC was supposed to do, in my view, after failing to get the 50+1 threshold in the May 2024 general election, was to go to the leftist parties, bring those parties together and speak in one voice. Because whether you're talking about domestic policies, we are talking about foreign policies, the ANC and the DA are too well apart. I don't think that was a good move. That is one of the reasons why we're where we are right now.
Yeah. So by and large, you strongly believe that the GNU does not reflect the ideals of pan-Africanism.
No, I don't think so. This was just something that was imposed on us by the outcome of the election. Unlike the real GNU we had in 1994, which was premeditated, because it was enshrined in the 1993 interim constitution, which was supposed to be in place from 1994 up to 1999. And you remember that F.W. de Klerk in 1996 announced that he was going to pull out from that GNU, and indeed he did so in 1997. But at least that was a GNU, because to come together and form a GNU, you do that because of a political climate at that given time. The ANC had won the elections, but then you still had the GNU with two deputy presidents. That was part of the political makeup at that time. Right now is something totally different because no party won the election. So I don't think that this coalition government is serving South Africa well.
And in the spirit of pan-Africanism, what should pan-Africanist leaders do at this conjuncture, Prof, to rescue South Africa from the debacle of GNU? Because South Africa is one of the most unequal society, particularly because of white supremacy in South Africa. So how do we, or what role should Pan-African leaders play in the current conditions in South Africa?
Ideally, African countries and African leaders could assist South Africa. That's an ideal situation. But the real situation is that even that is difficult because it will depend on the country that is handling that particular African, on the foreign country that is handling that particular African country. Like I said, that as Africans, we are not united. So it means that if, say, for example, a country from West Africa or West Central Africa wants to make an input in South Africa's current political affairs, they will be doing so basically propagating the ideas that come from France. That is one reality. And then if a country comes from the Anglophone states, by and large, they will be propagating ideas that come from the UK. So which means, therefore, already we have a problem that these individual countries, they also don't embrace the Pan-African idea in their own countries. Then it will be difficult for them to then sell out that idea to South Africa and then say, do this, because they themselves don't believe in what they will be saying to South Africa must do. Let alone the fact that as South Africans, we are also not united. The reality is that you have the ANC, looking this way, you have the DA looking that way, you have parties like the PAC, which all along have told us that land is the main issue. But then suddenly, when they are co-opted into the coalition government, then there is a deafening silence. So which means we have a serious problem, my brother, more than what we see currently. Going forward, it means that we'll have to do things differently. Even if it means reviewing our constitution, which is one point that I've been making, that whenever we can't do certain things, we say the constitution does not allow it. The question then becomes, who crafted the constitution? Is it not us? 30 years down the line, have we not identified some loopholes that need to be fixed so that we can take the country forward? Those are some of the critical questions which will need a proper leadership to take the country forward and then eventually take the continent forward.
Yeah, you're talking about the leadership in the continent, embracing or trying to embrace pan-Africanism. And that reminds me of what the late Chris Hani said, and I quote, he said, "What I fear is that the liberators emerge as elitists who drive around in Mercedes-Benz and use the resources of our country to live in palaces and gather riches." What do you make of that statement? And how should our leaders live or conduct themselves? Should they live in shacks? Should they walk and not drive? What do you make of the current Pan-Africanist leaders at this point in context or in regards to what the late Chris Hani said?
My brother, the words you just cited from Chris Hani were profound. Chris Hani was one of the visionary leaders of this country. In fact, had he not been assassinated, we'd be talking a different story right now. In fact, the main reason why he was killed was because he was against Codesa. That is the truth, absolute truth, which everyone should always go back to. Because he said, we cannot go into exile, train to fight, and then suddenly we say we must sit around the table to get our freedom. He was against that. And then, of course, was eliminated. As to who was involved, then the rest is history. But to come back to your point, we don't necessarily expect our leaders to live in shacks because we want them to be our role models. But we don't want them to have the opulent lifestyle that they are having. I was talking in another forum and I was asking the question, why do you leaders insist on being called honorable leaders even if you don't do anything honorable? Initially, they frowned, but then when I unpacked that, they understood where I was coming from. Because I went to an extent of saying that some of you were our students. We taught you, and some of you could barely make it. You get 48, 49%. We go back to your assignment, we reread it, so that at least we can give you the 1 or 2%.
You're exposing us, Prof, now.
And then, yeah, in fact, I'm being realistic, my brother. And then suddenly, somebody becomes a mayor, somebody becomes a premier, somebody becomes a minister, and then you drive around where there's a blue lights, and then when you come, all of us have to give way, and then because the most important person has come. Why should we do that? They are always rushing, and we don't even know where they are rushing to. I have a problem with that. In other words, the point I'm making is, it's true that they are serving us because we elected them. So they are serving us, let's give them that. But then the opulent lifestyle that they are living is unwarranted, especially at the time when our economy is not doing well. They must scale down. Even the size of parliament, in my view, is a problem. 400 members, and then the size of the executive is too high. At times, we even have ministries that have 2 deputy ministers. I don't understand the logic behind that. Because if you are a minister, I'm your deputy. If you are not available, I don't step in. Somebody else has to act in opposition. So then why do I exist? So there are quite a number of things that need to happen. So in other words, the point I'm making, my brother, is that while it is true that our leaders should not live like paupers, but at least they must scale down and then put the country first. The very people who voted them, you cannot be having a house in Pretoria, a house in Cape Town, a car in Pretoria, a car in Cape Town, you are flying you up and down, and then in your homestead, where you come from, your neighbor lives in a shack. and doesn't know where the next meal will come from. Those are some of the issues. We need a balancing act, so to speak, without necessarily saying that our leaders must live in shacks, because that will be an embarrassment to the rest of the continent and then to the rest of the world.
Now let's move into our topic today, Prof. As we observe and mark the 31st anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, in which almost 1 million people were killed in Rwanda in 1994, particularly the Tutsis. What can you tell us about the Rwandan genocide?
Okay, my brother, historically, people who are to blame for the Rwandan genocide are the Belgians. What the Belgians did in the 1950s was that they introduced an education system that set the Hutus and the Tutsis apart. They would make sure that if you were a Tutsi, you had better access to education, and then subsequently you had better jobs in government departments. And then the Hutus, on the other hand, were pushed to the periphery. That's where this whole thing started. So that if you are a Hutu, you know that you cannot, do better than the Tutsi and so on and so forth. But then what brought this a particular matter on the table was that President Habyarimana had gone out discussing peace for the country. On his way back, as the flight was about to land at the airport, it was shot down, and he was a Hutu. President Habyarimana was a Hutu. And then the plane was shot, and then he was killed. Immediately thereafter, then the Hutus then said he was killed by the Tutsis, and therefore all the Tutsis must be eliminated. And by the way, I must say that it's not only the Tutsis that were killed. Some of the moderate Hutus were also killed. If you were a Hutu and you were assumed to be sympathetic to the Tutsi, you were also killed. And then between April 7 and July 19, around 1 million, they say between 500 and 800,000 people died. Some say around 1 million, but the point is a lot of people died. And about 200,000 of them were displaced. They had to go to other places. So basically, that is the history in a nutshell. But the question then becomes, when all of these things were happening, where was the UN? Where was the OAU, which is now the AU? Those are some of the critical questions, because this was not just something that happened over a weekend. It took a very long time, about 100 days, and still there was nothing done to try and save the people of Rwanda, in this case, the Tutsis in the main.
And of course, talking about the international bodies like the UN and the African Union, apparently, as you allude, they were ball watching, standing by. In your view, what stopped them from intervening and playing a mediation role? 100 days is such a long time.
It's a couple of factors, my brother. The first one is leadership deficit. There was lack of leadership, both at a continental level and then, of course, at an international level. Because the UN has proven several times that it is toothless. Look at what is happening currently in the Palestinian situation. They should have acted by now. There are violations each and every day, but the UN is there, is doing nothing. And then when you ask the questions, but why are you guys not intervening? You are told about political sovereignty, that a country has political sovereignty. We are told about human rights, but do people of Palestine don't have rights? Those are the critical questions. The same situation then applied in the Rwandan genocide. Some said, okay, let's do the watch and see game. Let's see how this will pan out into. And then, meanwhile, the situation escalated. Number two, you would have expected that either the then OAU, which is now the AU, or the UN would have sent peacekeeping missions to try and contain the situation, but they didn't do so. Part of the reason is that whenever there are chaotic situations on the African continent, there are many countries that benefit from that chaos, which is the same thing that is happening in the DRC. So you will find that some in the UN, for example, you know that in the UN, you have what is called the P5 countries, 5 permanent members, and they have a vested interest in what happens in each and every country on the African continent. So the longer this political chaos is sustained, the better for them, because it means that they can come in through the back door and then claim to be peacemakers claim to be assisting the country. Meanwhile, they're assisting themselves. So those are some of the many factors that resulted into this thing dragging for that long without anyone acting. They could have acted, they should have acted, but they didn't.
And we understand that at the back of the genocide, it's the Belgium, or rather the Berlin Conference, which set the stage for colonialism and, of course, sowing divisions in African countries. But let's look at how much of a role has the West played in Rwanda, or in Rwandan genocide?
The West will always play a role, particularly because the African continent in general, and then the countries in Central Africa have a number of mineral resources which the West wants to have access to. And then what they normally do is they go to the media and they preach peace. And then once that clip is done, then of course they go somewhere and then they do something else. What they normally do is that they would go to the media and say that we want this situation to end. And then on the other side, they will be arming those who are responsible for sustaining the conflict. That is the same thing that is happening in the DRC. That's the same thing that has been happening in Nigeria, for example. So basically, the US is very good in terms of playing for both teams. They will come and then seem to be playing for Team A, and then they leave the stage, they play for Team B. That is why even in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, they will be preaching peace in the media, and then immediately thereafter, they approve the dispatchment of funds and the dispatchment of arms and ammunition going to Benjamin Netanyahu. So that is what they've been doing all along. And on the Berlin conference, they'll tell you that we didn't colonize anyone. That is how they were going to say it. We came in to try and rescue the situation, as it were. That is how they portray themselves. But you and I know that what they are saying is the opposite of what they normally do.
Yeah, and Rwanda is considered as one of the African countries' fastest growing economies. What could be the secret there? We understand that Paul Kagame has had an iron grip on Rwanda for decades. He came into office around the year 2000, and he has systematically dealt with all opposition to his rule. Some disappeared, some were arrested, some fled the country. How do you describe his rule? Would you say he's an autocratic leader?
In the main, let's start by looking at how Paul Kagame got into this position.
Yeah.
He didn't get the position through civilian rule. He overthrew government. And then what he did once he was in office, he used an iron hand. Terrible as he has been, but he has done a fantastic job. What we see in South Africa, in Johannesburg and Durban, for example, where the cities are filthy, you will never find something like that in Rwanda. Because he made sure that every Friday, if you are working for government, you must take an hour to go and clean in your area, to make sure that government offices are clear, everything is clear. You cannot throw anything from a taxi, otherwise you will be counted. So those are the kinds of things that is done. So basically, by silencing the other political parties, he then put power into his office, and then everything else that he decides will happen. There is basically an attempt to create the impression that there are political parties. You remember in the recent elections, he got 93%, which means that there was an election and he emerged victorious with 93%. How that happened, please don't ask me, I don't know. The reality is he is able to maneuver his way within the democratic framework without necessarily saying that political parties are not allowed, but then he has his own way of silencing them. And the intelligence in Rwanda is very strong, unlike ours. It's very strong. If you say something against government, then you'll be hunted down regardless of where you are, and then they will eliminate you. You remember the case that happened of a former Rwandese who was killed in Johannesburg under very mysterious circumstances. So that is how strong and effective the intelligence is. And then, of course, he's feared. That is why he has sustained himself for this long. As for the likes of Yoweri Museveni, it's a different story altogether, but he has also been there forever. Paul Biya in Cameroon has been there forever, but for different reasons. And their countries are not doing as well as Rwanda is doing. So Paul Kagame has gotten something right, operating within the democratic frame, but then, of course, using his own tactics to find his way.
Yeah, and as we wrap up, Prof, let's look at the interest that Rwanda might have in the eastern DRC. We understand there are reports that indicate that Rwanda has backed up the M23 rebels. What sort of interest does Paul Kagame, as the president, has in the eastern DRC?
Eastern DRC is the richest part of the country. And that is the reason why the likes of Patrice Lumumba were killed, for example. You look at the Katanga region, that is where most of the minerals are found. So then if you sponsor M23, you then stand a better chance to benefit once M23 takes over government. That is the primary reason. You wouldn't just assist M23 for nothing. It's an investment for him. In other words, you assist M23 so that in the event that they take over government, then you will be in a position to discuss with them what the deal entails and then what to get from there. So primarily, the main reason are the minerals that are found in the eastern part of the DRC, including the Katanga region.
All right, Prof, thank you very much for making time. I hope next time you'll be in studio so that we can have enough time to engage on a number of issues affecting the continent.
Let's hope so, my brother. Thank you very much for having me and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Thanks for tuning in to this week's edition of the EFF podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, please continue to subscribe to the EFF podcast. We've come to the end of the show. My name is Titus Tungo. Until we meet again, good day. Go and get that. Can remember.